The Day the Dead Rose, Day 1, The Outbreak, by A.R. Pearson. Copyright 2019, all rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without the author's written permission. Warning: this book contains adult content, foul language, intense horror scenes, and extremely graphic material that will likely be too disturbing for many readers. Discretion is advised. Additionally, this is a work of fiction. All names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidences are either products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, are coincidence, and likewise, any actual places are created to benefit the story only and not intended to be factually correct. Chapter 1. Ajay, Pismo Beach, California, 4:03 a.m. It was pitch dark. How I even found my way was beyond me. But regardless of how I arrived in the bathroom, I was there, and I hoped I wouldn't piss on the floor. Pissing indoors in the dark is always a gamble, something like a poor man's Russian roulette, only a much safer version. My aim was pinpoint accurate, and I was careful, so it was well worth the risk. Not turning the light on meant I'd have no problem getting back to sleep. I'd rather chance pissing on the floor over tossing and turning until the alarm started screaming at me to get up and go to work. The sound of flowing water was almost hypnotic to my tired, cloudy head. The high-pressure stream that splashed loudly slowly began to change into the rattling and vibrating of metal and plastic. The darkness that surrounded me partially lifted, and indirect light encroached around the edges of my vision. Next thing I knew, I bounced up and down from the motion of a moving vehicle. Someone held a white bandage or gauze pad of some kind against my forehead. The outer portion of the towel covered my eyes, effectively blinding me. Every bump of the poorly maintained public road tested the limits of my overfull bladder. My left hand was sore and crusted with dried liquid of some kind. I used my sore, crusted hand to probe around at my crotch. Thankfully, I felt dry. A brace immobilized my neck and wrapped around my chin. The skin across the bridge of my nose pulled tight when my eyes opened. Nothing came to me. My thoughts were blank and I felt curiously numb inside. There were no memories of getting ready for work or driving anywhere. It was as if my hard drive was rebooted or, worse, deleted. Confused, I said, "Oh, what happened? Where am I?" My throat was so dry my voice croaked when I spoke. A searing pain shot out from between my eyes and turned into a thumping drum as it rounded the back of my head. The paramedic who was holding pressure to my forehead said, "You were in an accident. We're almost to AGC." I tried to unsuccessfully shake my head as I croaked, Where's that?" This time when he spoke, I noticed something in his voice. A sound or a tone, I couldn't place it. He said, "Oh, sorry, it's trade jargon. AGC means Royal Grande Community Hospital." He sounded like he started to trail off. I wondered if he was falling asleep. I said, Am I okay? Did I piss myself? I had a crazy dream." I felt the pressure let up on my forehead as he twisted around and said, "No, you look dry, and I think you're okay. The other man that was involved, he said that you climbed down from the truck, and you even texted a few people before you passed out." The paramedic's voice sounded monotone and borderline lethargic as he spoke. Now I felt ashamed or embarrassed. Why couldn't I remember anything? What was the last thing I could remember? Interrupting my thoughts, the paramedic let out a long, slow breath as if trying to control his breathing. Maybe my head was beginning to clear because I noticed the rapid acceleration, aggressive cornering, and last-minute braking. Apparently, the driver wanted to get me to the hospital as fast as possible. I thought of Victoria and wondered if it was her I texted. I said, "My lunch pail and cell phone, are they here?" He breathed in carefully, then lightly cleared his throat and said, "Yeah, they're here." Has the bleeding stopped?" I asked as I pointed to my face. For the first time since I woke up, the bloody gauze pad began to lift slightly from my forehead. It tugged slightly on my bloody wound. My eyes instinctively almost shut from the sudden bombardment of light. Indirect or not, my eyes were still sensitive, and I had to force them to stay open. I blinked, and it felt like hundreds of tiny rocks grated across the surface of my eyeball. I winced from the painful scratching and instinctively blinked my eyes several more times, working the debris to the sides of my eyes. The paramedic leaned over and inspected my forehead and said, "Yeah, it looks like it stopped." I blinked pain-free several more times and said, "Thanks. Could I ask a favor of you? Would you please hand me my phone? I'm not sure exactly where it is, but I'd really like to text my wife or at least see what I texted her. I don't remember anything." The paramedic, who still sat next to me, took long, slow breaths, almost as if trying to calm his nerves. It was hard to get a good look at him because of the neck brace. However, I could see him if I strained my vision down far enough. He had black rings forming under his eyes, and the rest of his face was greenish pale. He looked like a man that was about to toss his cookies, or possibly already did. He looked over to the 30-can Ozark Trail cooler I used as my lunch pail, closed his eyes and exhaled deeply, like he was trying to find the strength to bridge the 3 feet that separated him from the cooler. He nodded his head hesitantly 3 or 4 times, but I think it was intended as motivation rather than communication. As he leaned forward, he said, "Yeah, I can do that, I think." He grunted and winced as if some anonymous force poked him in the ribs. After what seemed like a difficult task, he handed me my phone and tried to recover his breath while he said, "Here you go." I reached out my disgusting left hand, took hold of my phone, and said, "Thank you." I began to go through my text messages. Apparently, I texted my wife, Victoria, first at 3:39 a.m. and told her about the crash. She responded at 3:49 a.m., letting me know that she thought she was going into labor and her brother Jesse would take her to the hospital, and to get there as fast as possible. She also said that my mom would be staying at our house with our kids. Before, my head hurt and every muscle in my body felt sore and achy. Now, I felt butterflies fluttering around in my stomach and had the overwhelming urge to smile. A warm tear tickled the sides of my face as it ran over my temples into my hair. Then I laughed. I found it almost hysterical that our third child would choose right now to come, while I was on my way to an ER in Arroyo Grande. I knew deep down I wasn't seriously hurt. All I needed was a few stitches, and hopefully I'd be on my way in an hour or two. I checked my other text messages. My boss, Tim, messaged me at 3:46 a.m. He said to let him know what hospital I was going to, and he was going to be on his way in 10 minutes. I messaged him what hospital I was going to, and within 10 seconds he replied, OMW, which was text slang for on my way. I also had a few other text messages from Jesse and my mother. However, I didn't check them. I powered my phone off and slid it into my left front pants pocket. Over the last few minutes, the fog had started to settle and memories of what happened began to surface. I remembered seeing glimpses of a fat man at the scene of the crash. I think his name was Dustin or maybe David. I can't be sure. I barely remember talking to him. It was like a mirage in my mind. I could almost see the two of us standing there. However, the vast majority of our conversation was nothing more than white noise. I remembered the truck sliding on its side. Dirt and wet grass forced its way through the shattered passenger side window. With my right hand, I reached up and touched my left shoulder. Only a moment ago there was no pain, but after remembering the events, my neck and shoulder began to ache and throb. Just then the driver applied the brakes much harder than was necessary. As soon as we stopped, the driver door opened and didn't close. Footsteps on the asphalt pattered by outside, and then disappeared behind the ambulance. The rear handle clicked and the door partially opened. As fast as the man appeared, he disappeared, turned, and almost jogged through the glass doors that led into the ER. The man in back with me struggled out the back door and rolled my gurney off the edge. He dropped the legs down, and before I knew it, I was rolling. While he rolled me out, I saw the name on his shirt said Richards. His face was even greener than only minutes before. I could tell he was struggling to roll me through the double sliding glass doors. After some serious concentration on his part and a stressful ride on mine, he finally parked me next to a wall just beyond the nurse's station. Richards displayed the look of a man who was unsure, or maybe it was nervousness, I couldn't tell, but something was definitely wrong. Richard's eyes darted around the room as if he were frantically searching for something he knew should be there. However, he didn't seem to find whatever it was he searched for. Richards looked down to me, then he looked down the long hallway. Then he looked back to me, and it was then I knew exactly what he looked for. He bumped into the wall with his right shoulder as he started to walk away. Richards partially recovered before he stopped altogether and shook his head. He cupped his hands under his green-tinted lips to catch the thick strands of saliva that began to leak from the edges of his mouth. He froze partially and bent over, his eyes wide with panic. Thick saliva dangled like marionette strings as he looked back and forth, unsure what to do. Clear droplets of spittle began to squeeze out from between his clenched lips and drip off his chin. With his mouth almost full of what I guessed to be saliva, he said, "Oh no. Oh, God damn it. Oh no." Spit and froth flowed profusely from his mouth with every word he uttered. His cheeks bulged out, then his hands moved up to clamp tight over his lips. A high-pressure stream of saliva sprayed out from between his fingers. Richards took one staggering half-step with his right foot and pitched his head down. I turned my eyes up, suddenly finding the ceiling incredibly interesting. Richards heaved a few times and as many puddles of vomit splashed on the tile floor. He stood frozen in embarrassment, or maybe it was shock. A chunk of something that could have been a French fry clung to his chin. After a few seconds he looked at me again, but after seeing my expression he quickly turned his eye back down to the floor. He cleared his throat a few times, struggling to think of what to do or what to say. I pinched my nose from the sharp acidic odor of partially digested fast food and stomach bile. Then Richard staggered forward with uncoordinated half-steps till he was gone from my restricted vision. Silence loomed throughout the entire emergency room while everyone tried to comprehend what happened. Then several people started to talk all at once. There was no way of understanding the chaotic, jumbled mess of commotion, so I laid there and waited for someone to move me away from the vomit. The rancid fumes began to make me sick. My mouth salivated uncontrollably. Closing my eyes, I took several long, slow breaths. I repeatedly swallowed spit down like water till the sensation to vomit subsided. Footsteps pattered across the waiting room and disappeared out the main entrance. The footsteps didn't disappear because of achieving some great distance. No, they disappeared because the lady that ran outside stopped on a dime and threw up. Based on the sounds of her heaving, she didn't make it far past the sliding doors of the main entrance either. Thankfully, the splashing was distant and faint. However, the heaving was just plain hard to listen to. It's an odd feeling, only being able to hear and smell the vomit. First, I had the mental picture painted by the disgusting sounds of Richard's chunky vomit that splashed on the tile floor. The foul odor came next, and for some reason, it reminded me of a night I drank way too much tequila. A nurse abruptly took hold of my gurney and pushed me down the long hallway into a room on the left. She looked to be in her early 20s, maybe 23 or 24. She was close to my height, around 6 foot or so, maybe a little less. She had wavy, light red hair that hung slightly past her shoulders. She dressed like the other nurse, only she had blue scrubs as opposed to green. She said, The doctor will be with you shortly. Just be patient, please. Happy to no longer have a pile of vomit as a neighbor, I said. Thank you. But before I could say anything else, someone faintly gagged from off down the long hallway. It sounded like it came from the lobby, but I couldn't be sure. The nurse looked at me, mashed her lips together, and shook her head in frustration. She didn't quite slam my chart in the clear plastic holder on the back of the door, but it was close. I saw her mouth the words, "God damn it," as she left the room. It took every bit of restraint I had not to laugh at her. She tried to slam the door, but the gas struts caught the flung door and eased it close. With every minute that passed, there was more and more commotion from out in the hallway. I pulled out my phone from my pocket and powered it on. It was 4:27 a.m. The only new text I had was from Tim, saying that he should be there around 6 a.m. I was so relieved to hear that, I actually smiled for what felt like the first time all morning. Over the next few minutes, I began to remember meteors or comets covering the sky. It felt like a dream till now, but it was no dream. I mumbled, "That's right, I remember now." I remembered sitting on top of the rolled over truck, and I watched the green tracers fall like some kind of magical fluorescent rain. It was beautiful. There were thousands of them. The reflections over the water made the ocean glow green. Someone began to heave and gag just outside the door to my room. A small amount of yellow bile oozed in from under the shut door. He continued to heave violently, pushing every single bit of air from his lungs. I kept expecting to hear a large howling intake of air, but it never came. There was only a painful silence, then a loud bang on the wall just past my door. "Are you okay out there?" I don't know why I asked. It was clear he was pretty far from okay. People don't usually heave so hard they pass out. Then I remembered the first paramedic, the one that opened the door. I wondered if he had been sick also. Next was Richards. Then I think there were two more, possibly three others. Richards vomiting on the floor struck me as unusual. However, it didn't raise any red flags by itself. Honestly, I didn't really give it much thought. But now, after so many people seemingly being sick, something was definitely going on. I wonder if it had anything to do with the events in the sky earlier. As the minutes passed, less and less people could be heard from the hallway outside. I figured people were probably avoiding the area. But then it struck me as strange. I hadn't heard anyone come to help the man outside my door. Even stranger, he should have gotten up already, shouldn't he have? People don't usually pass out for this long, do they? Eager to take my compulsive mind off the complete lack of sounds in a busy emergency room, I opened up my YouTube app. The top suggested video was titled, "London Decimated by Comet." The view counter read 14 million. I shook my aching head, thinking I must have read it wrong. 14 million already? It couldn't have been that long. I don't remember exactly what time it happened, but it couldn't have been much more than an hour ago. I clicked on the 2-minute, 24-second video and held my breath while the gut-wrenching video began to play. I guessed it was sometime around midday over there. White tails stretched out behind blurry, yellowish-orange fireballs as they screamed toward London at acute angles of about 30 degrees. There were visible percussions each time one slammed into something. Columns of black smoke rose high from mushroom clouds of suffocating white and gray dust. The number of incoming comets were too great to keep track of. The only thing I could compare it to would be throwing a handful of gravel into a pond. Hundreds of buildings burned as far as the panoramic view displayed. A large fireball as wide as the London Bridge smashed into the middle of it. In an instant, a 100-foot section of the bridge just vanished. More cars than I dared to count drove off the destroyed bridge from both directions. There was so much smoke and dust, or maybe it was steam. I wasn't sure. All I knew was the vehicles disappeared as they fell into the thick, dirty gray cloud below. The River Thames, from what I could see of it, was filled with floating debris, muddy ash, and sinking vehicles. Huge flames flickered, illuminating thick clouds of dust and smoke right where the Tower of London would be. I guess there must have been too many people watching the video because the loading circle appeared on the center of my screen and the video froze. I pressed the back arrow, but that screen wouldn't load either. I closed the app and tried to reopen it, but this time the whole app was down. I was only wasting my battery now, so I turned my phone off and put it back in my pocket. My stomach bubbled and burped from the intense video. I put my hands on my head and wondered how many people died. I'm not sure how long I laid there trying to guess what the hell was going on, but suddenly there was a knock, while at the same time the door swung inward. A short lady in a white doctor's coat entered the room. Her right foot narrowly missed the yellow filth that seeped under the door. At first sight she looked to be Mong, and I could tell she was on the edge. Yeah, something told me things had become far worse out there now. Someone wearing tennis shoes ran down the long hallway, jumping over something. The shoes chirped with every stride, till finally the noises were too distant to hear through the closed door. Trying hard to control my nerves, I said, "Hi, Doc." She removed the file from the back of the door and looked it over briefly. Then she stepped over to me and began to inspect my head as she said, "Hello, Mr. Galloway. You having any other pain besides the obvious?" I tried to shake my head, but the neck brace stopped me, and I said, "No, not anymore. I had a pretty bad headache earlier, but it's mostly gone now. Pretty much just sore and achy." She jabbed a short stubby finger near my wound and said, "Does this hurt?" I winced from the searing pain that burned across my forehead and said, "Ow! Yeah, that hurt," trying not to give Captain Obvious a dirty look. She looked down at me, frowned, and said, "Okay, Mr. Galloway, I'll give you stitches now. Then I'll come back for you when they're ready to do your x-rays, okay?" I nodded and said okay. She walked over to the cabinets by the sink on the other side of the room. She grabbed some stuff, washed her hands, and pulled on some latex gloves. After she gathered all her things, she looked at me and said, "Okay, are you ready now?" "As I'll ever be." Next thing I know, a needle moved toward my forehead. My instincts almost made me flinch when it neared my eyes. The needle prick felt like an intense bee sting, and suddenly the pain was replaced by numbness. She continued to inject more and more of the local around the wound, but only the first injection resulted in any pain. After thoroughly numbing it, she wiped it with what I guessed to be an alcohol wipe. Then a little curved fishhook needle quickly moved up to my face. As soon as the needle came near, I closed my eyes and kept them that way till she finished. There was no pain, only a weird tugging sensation that made me feel a little bit sick to my stomach. As soon as she finished, she peeled off her latex gloves, washed her hands, and said, "Okay, Mr. Galloway, I'll have someone come and get you when it's time for your x-rays." I almost told her about my wife and if she could expedite the process, but for some reason I didn't. She looked at me briefly, and when I didn't say anything, she said, "Okay then, Mr. Galloway, I'll see you soon," and she turned and walked out the door. My back had stiffened up. I'm not sure if it was from the whiplash or just because I had been laying on an examination table for getting close to an hour now. I didn't have a bad back. However, it was a tired back from years of laborious work. While I lay there waiting, I heard several more people vomit. None of them were as close as the man that lay just outside my room, but still hearing all those people suffering was hard to endure. I still had not totally wrapped my mind around the fact that there was a person passed out in his own vomit in the hallway. My thoughts were interrupted when the room went dark. The darkness seemed to loom far longer than it should have. The hospital was creepy in the dark. I'm not sure why, but it was. After a minute or so, the lights flickered back on, only much dimmer than before. I pulled out my cell and saw the time was 4:58. I hoped the doctor would hurry up with the x-rays because I was running out of time. If Tim arrived before the x-rays, I was out. I found it almost funny that I was trying to leave one hospital only to rush to another. I watched the clock move slowly, very slowly. The seconds felt like minutes as I lay there confined by my neck brace. I had a half a mind to stand up and take the damn thing off, but for some reason I just laid there for another 25 minutes. 6 or 7 more people vomited from other places nearby. One of them was in a room not too far from mine. At 5:25, I stood up, peeled off the neck brace, and tossed it on the chair in the corner. I was done waiting. Besides, they clearly had bigger problems than my precautionary back and neck x-rays. I hung my lunch pail over my shoulder and slowly opened the door. Cautiously, I peered down at the floor where I thought the man would be. His face was ghostly pale and smushed up against the dark brown 4-inch vinyl baseboard. Horrible black veins bulged from his pale skin, almost as if tar or sludge flowed through them. His eyes were open, but he didn't so much as blink during the 30 seconds I stared at him. I forced my eyes away from the lifeless man and looked down the hallway. There were 6 or 7 more people sporadically sprawled out down both sides of the long hallway. The hallway reeked of vomit and shit. The smell was indescribable. Slowly, I made my way back to the emergency room lobby, stepping over sick people that partially blocked the hallway as I went. Richard's vomit was now beginning to coagulate to the floor. Many of the nurses I heard talking earlier were now gone. I peered around the partition to see chunky vomit on the floor. Looking further revealed 2 female nurses face down half under the desk. The nurses' station was set up like a large L, separated from the lobby by small divided booths with windows that opened. On the far side of the L-shaped nurses' station were 2 nurses sitting well away from any of the infected hospital staff that littered the floor behind the glass. I sidestepped to the right and peeked to the far wall. There were 3 additional hospital employees in green scrubs in unnatural positions on the floor. Every one of them was either covered with or laying in bodily fluids. There was so much filth the floor beneath could hardly be seen. From as far away as they could be behind the counter, the 2 nurses stared at me. They were almost huddled up as if trying to hide each other from the sickness that surrounded them. One of them I recognized as the red-headed nurse that took me to the room. I shivered from the looks of sheer horror that was on their faces. I held up my hands and said, I have to go. I have to go home. Do you want me to sign anything before I leave? The other nurse wore green scrubs and had dark brown hair. Her mouth seemed to be partially stuck open as she tried to shake her head, but she couldn't seem to snap herself out of her daze. I nodded and tipped an imaginary hat to the ladies and walked through the door that led to the main lobby. It was a large lobby, probably around 75 feet by 75 feet. 30 or 40 uncomfortable wooden chairs with paisley-patterned cushions lined 2 of the walls. There were also another 40 or more chairs in the middle of the room. They were lined up in rows. Each row had a red oak end table with magazines on both sides. All the sitting room was taken, however. Only 2 or 3 people actually sat in their chairs. The others were slouched and slumped. All of them, except for a few, looked to be unconscious. At a glance, it seemed that every single person was covered in vomit or bodily fluid of some kind. In addition, there was also maybe as many as 20 more people lying on the ground. I'll never forget the sound that came from that room. A teenage girl leaned against the wall just behind the door I held open. She hugged her knees while rocking back and forth. Her forehead pressed against her forearms, and she would not look away from the floor between her legs. Between her whimpers and sniffling, she hummed, "You Are My Sunshine." Directly in front of her was an elderly couple. Motionless, the man hung forward, his head awkwardly dangling over his interlocked hands. He wore brown, fuzzy bedroom slippers that rested carelessly in a pool of his own bloody vomit. His elderly wife must have been 80 years old. She quietly sobbed while rubbing his back. While she was obviously upset and concerned for her husband, that's not what she stared at. Her watery eyes stared at a boy on the floor, writhing in pain. He twisted and arched as he gagged and fought for breath. His little face was blue and his eyes bulged, as if ready to pop out of his little head. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't find even one single breath. Somehow it shocked me when he When he finally seemed to find some peace and went still, I scanned around the room looking for anyone I thought could be the boy's mother. She had to be there, right? Or was she off somewhere else dying? I thought that'd be more likely. Everybody in the room told the exact same story: pain, suffering, bodily fluids, and death. There was the sound of a child blowing bubbles in a melted Frosty, and the boy's pants filled up as if he wore a diaper. The smell of wet shit and sight of his soiled pajama bottoms made me start to cry. I had to get out of there. Should I run? I almost called 911, but the fuck did I expect them to do? These people were already at the damn hospital. I ran outside. The glass door slid closed behind me. As I passed, I noticed the nurses stood looking at the just deceased boy on the floor. As soon as the glass doors fully closed behind me, I heard something inside. I turned just in time to see the elderly man fall forward. He landed on his face. With all the speed of a 20-year-old, his wife stood up. However, she couldn't straighten up her back fast enough, and her white tennis shoes slipped in her husband's vomit. At the same time, her hip slammed down on the tile floor. The right side of her head smacked the thinly cushioned seat bottom of her chair. She landed in a heap in her husband's bloody vomit. I could hear moaning cries for help through the glass door. Not knowing what else to do, I ran. I ran past the people that lay on the sidewalk that led to the street. Once out to the street, I ran north past car after car that sat either abandoned or housed infected people. Everywhere I looked, chunky vomit slowly dripped from cars or corridors, only to puddle up in the street. I jumped over 2 puddles of vomit that had merged into one. When I disturbed the air around the filthy puddles, a swarm of flies took flight. Some slapped me in the face, while others simply buzzed by as I kept on going. After running by 10 or 12 more cars, I noticed something that brought me to a stop. There were 2 men, and neither of them seemed to be sick. I was breathing heavily as I approached the 2 men. One looked like a farmer with jean overalls and a straw hat. The other man was short, slender, and he looked to be Asian. The 2 men looked confused. They looked exactly how I think I looked only moments ago, before I realized exactly how bad this was. The man in overalls seemed like he wanted to speak, however, his expression was one of confusion, and he said nothing. I must have freaked out the 2 men because they both took precautionary steps backward as I approached. A car door slammed and a lady ran full speed around her still idling red SUV. She flung open the right side rear door, revealing a young boy of maybe 3 or 4 years old in his car seat. The boy's head leaned forward while he vomited on himself. His mother unbuckled the child's safety belt. Instantly the boy fell forward into his mother's arms. She rolled the boy over and cradled him tightly while he struggled for breath. Chunks of vomit flew up in the air as he heaved and coughed. She leaned back against her red SUV, clutching her baby boy. Then her back slid down the side of the SUV till she sat on the blacktop road, weeping loudly. She pulled her child in close to her chest and rested her chin on the top of his head. I could see yellow vomit and red blood on his mother's shirt. The lady attempted to soothe her boy by stroking his hair and rocking him back and forth. I could hear her muttering over my heavy breathing, but I couldn't tell what she said. She looked over at us and spoke urgently in desperation. "Please help him. Please, I don't know what to do. Oh my God, please, not my baby boy." The lady, screaming, turned to hysterical sobbing. I didn't know what to say. Hell, there was nothing to say. I felt so fucking hopeless, I shrugged my shoulders and mouthed the words, "I'm so sorry." My lower back began to burn again, maybe from whiplash or maybe from the stress of watching the young boy fight for breath. He wasn't much older than my daughter, and the sight of him covered in vomit, sloshed against his mother's car, made my heart ache. His mouth seemed to be stuck open as he dry heaved so desperately his eyes bulged out, and his pale face glowed red. Then the boy went still. All the gasping and gagging ceased. His mother drew him in close and squeezed his shoulders against her chest. He hung there limp in her embrace. His head and arms flopped around every time his mother jostled his lifeless body. The boy's mother began to wail a horrible cry, and my eyes welled up with more tears. She began to scream out in rage. "Why? Why would you let this happen? He's just a child. He's just a damn child." Her voice gave out to the onslaught of tears that seemed to be limitless. I heard one of the men yelling at me as I ran away. I don't know if it just didn't register to my ears or I was too shocked to look back, but whatever, it doesn't matter now. Leaving that horrible scene was all I cared about at that particular moment. After several hundred yards of running, my strides became clumsy and awkward. My feet began to slap the sidewalk, and I had to force myself to slow down before I tripped and took a tumble. On the grass, 10 feet off the sidewalk, there was a lady lying with her arm draped over a bundled-up pink blanket. What would happen to the two of them, I wondered. Then I saw the yellow bile that speckled the grass around the lady's face, and all my wondering stopped. I didn't want to know. As I walked past, I could hear the faint sounds of an infant crying. An intense shiver ran across my shoulders, and I stared at the ground while I passed, not daring to look. Not far from the lady on the grass, I came to the end of the backed-up traffic. One of the last cars had its driver's door open. A man laid face down on the asphalt. As I passed, I could see a shoe sticking out from beyond the front of his bumper. I turned my focus to the bus stop a few hundred yards up the road. The bus stop was at the bottom of an exit from Highway 101, and it was a perfect place for Tim to see me. The bus stop sat across from a medium-sized, mostly empty parking lot from a handful of small businesses. One business had a beautiful redwood deck that wrapped around the entire front of the building. A man lay face down across the threshold of the open doorway. Each time the morning breeze blew, the door would bounce off the man and chime the bell mounted overhead. My instincts urged me to go help the poor man, but I knew from all my other experiences that morning there was nothing I could do. Over the next few minutes, only 2 more cars passed on the highway above, both headed south, and none passed heading north. Not long after, I heard the sound of a diesel engine in the distance. I knew the sound of that diesel. I flagged him down, and within 10 seconds, Tim exited the highway and parked by the bus stop. The stress in my shoulders lessened, and I let out a breath of relief. But Tim had the look of worry on his face, and that brought my excitement to an instant halt. Then I noticed the right side of my sleeveless undershirt was covered in dried blood. I tugged at the shirt and found it was partially stuck to my shoulder. I waved it away as I drew near to Tim and extended my right hand. Then I quickly recoiled it after seeing all the crusted dried blood. Tim frowned and said, "Normally I might be insulted, but, man, you look—" He paused mid-sentence, looking me over, shook his head and continued, "Well, let's just say I'm sure glad I brought the work truck. And what the hell's on your boots anyway?" he said, squinting his eyes while pointing to my feet. I shrugged my shoulders sheepishly and looked down at the puke that was rapidly drying to my boots. It's vomit, I think," I said, too sincere to have been a joke. Tim looked me up and down one more time, still studying me, and said, "Damn, man, are you okay?" I tried to smile, I really did, but I think it came out a little one-sided. And I said, "No, Tim, I don't think we are." I looked at the ground and kicked some small pebbles of blacktop with my right foot. I was trying to think of the best way to explain what was going on without sounding like a paranoid schizophrenic. A brief silence passed before I lifted my head and looked at Tim. I felt my eyes water up when I said, "Everyone's dying, Tim. I don't know why it is. I don't know why it's happening. All I know is They're all dead or dying. Oh, shit, just look at him. I pointed to the man lying face down on the redwood front porch across the parking lot. Tim said, "Holy shit, is that a person? Do they need help?" He started off in the man's direction. I put a filthy hand on his shoulder and said, "There's nothing you can do, bro. Trust me. There are men, women, and children all dead or dying in the street. The hospital's a fucking morgue right now. Even the fucking EMS responders that brought me here to the hospital got sick." Tim stood there with a confused grin on his face. He was doubtless expecting this to be some kind of joke. Yeah, the best prank ever. We would be telling our kids about this one many years from now. Tim, I'm not kidding, bro. Come on and check it out if you must. I'll show you, but I'm warning you, you're probably not going to want to see it. Tim nodded, and I could tell he wanted to see it for himself, so I grabbed my lunch pail and we both got in the truck. Tim pulled out on the main street, head south. He saw the long line of cars as soon as we turned on the frontage road. I said, "Park before the street off to the left," and I pointed to the small street that ran under the highway connecting both north and southbound frontage roads. Then I continued, "That line of cars ain't going anywhere, and we don't want to get blocked in if people pull up behind us." Tim parked exactly where I suggested. I could feel my nerves flaring up again. There was a spasm in my neck, and the right side of my lip went numb. "Tim, if you want to see, we're going to have to walk in on foot, but I think most of these people are probably dead by now." Tim frowned at me and stepped out of the truck. As soon as he opened the door, I felt the stench of shit and vomit hit me like a slap to the face. I saw his nose crinkle from the swarms of flies and the awful smell. Then he said, "So, how many people are we talking about here?" I whirled my finger in a circular motion to the almost mile of gridlocked traffic and said, "Most of them, maybe all of them, and probably the other side too. And everyone inside as well. I don't know, man, but I'm not shitting you, it's bad." He still looked disbelieving, but there was a look of acceptance creeping across his face. While he was looking around, I tapped him on the right shoulder and pointed to the left, the little red car with the open door, and said, "Go around over on the other side. He's lying on the ground." Tim walked curiously around the rear end of the red car. He gasped when his eyes found the dead man lying in a swirling puddle of red blood and yellow bile. However, now his knees were under him. His butt was up in the air and his face was flat against the blacktop. His body twitched several times, and Tim shifted his wide eyes at me and said, "Oh my God, he's not dead." I wanted to tell him, "Tim, no man, he's definitely dead," but seeing the man in the process of getting up caused me to second guess myself. I couldn't think of anything to say, so I just stared at Tim dumbly. The man's left cheek grated across the asphalt when he twisted to look up at Tim. Tim took a few small, tentative steps toward the vomit-covered man. The man moaned in a low, cracking voice, almost like someone who just got woke up disoriented, unsure where he was. Once close enough, Tim reached his hand down and took hold of his left shoulder. The man stopped moaning and lunged with snapping teeth. Surprised, Tim recoiled his hand. "Ah, Jesus Christ, what the fuck, man?" Tim wrapped his hand around the open flesh wound and kicked the man in the jaw. The man slammed up against the side of the car, but instantly turned his cloudy white eyes back at Tim. Tim was a big, strong dude, and I knew he could hold his own against almost anyone, so I wasn't too worried about the man kicking his ass or anything. I was worried in general because only moments ago I thought this man was dead. I laughed nervously. Did he just fucking bite you, bro?" But before Tim had time to respond, the man started to stand, and I heard a woman's voice from a long way off scream out in panic. "Help me, please! Oh my God, please stop following me, you sick fucking cannibals! Help! Anyone, please! I could hear her yelling, but I didn't see anyone. I looked over to Tim. He still seemed in shock that the fucker bit him. Blood dripped down his left hand off his fingers, and he said, It barely broke the skin. I'll be okay. Just go see if you can help her. I'll stay here with this fucking asshole. I nodded as I jogged away and heard Tim yell, "Motherfucker, you try to bite me again, you'll be spitting out teeth." I ran forward a few cars, jumping over all the vomit, shit, and dead people in my path. I lost track of Tim while I looked for the lady. To get a better look, I jumped up onto the hood of a car. Soon as the sheet metal hood crumpled under my weight, there was a hissing and thrashing from behind me. At first, I paid the noises no attention, but something about the anger in the noises made me glance back over my right shoulder. A lady sat, buckled into the driver's seat. Her face was pale with thick black veins. Her cloudy white eyes bulged from her sunken eye sockets. Her head weaved side to side, and she moaned a hideous sound that almost made my skin crawl. Soon as our eyes locked, she lunged her pale face in my direction. Her long, bile-soaked hair whipped forward as the seatbelt brought her to an instant stop. Undeterred by the distance between us, she kept clacking her teeth together every time she snapped her vicious jaws at me. Up the road, I finally saw the woman running from 2, maybe 3 people. I yelled, "Hey, over here! You better leave her alone or I'll fuck you up!" I could hear the lady in the car mashing her teeth together the whole time I yelled at the lady's pursuers. The lady looked up, trying to pinpoint the sound of my voice. I waved my arms over my head till she saw me. Once she realized she wasn't alone, her panicked, hysterical run became a focused, more determined run. I jumped down off the car and splashed in more vomit or shit, I wasn't sure which, and there was no time to look. I ran back over to the sidewalk and looked for the lady. I could see her now. She was getting close, maybe 100 yards away. Her pursuers lagged behind her, and I found it strange. They weren't running. It's more of a staggering walk. I turned to Tim, cut my hands around my mouth, and yelled, "Hey, bro, get in the truck. Get ready to go." I turned and ran to the lady and realized she was wearing blue nurse's scrubs. I closed it within 50 yards of the scrub-wearing lady, and for a second time that morning I saw the lady on the grass. I remembered her from earlier. She rose to her knees, snarled, and dove on the little pink blanket with snapping jaws. All I could hear was the sounds of a catfight, and everything else disappeared. You know, it's that little helpless cry newborn babies have before they get full use of their vocal cords. The lady's hands ripped the blanket away to expose the bare, pale skin beneath. The pink blanket flew to the left, and the naked baby rolled across the grass, bleeding to the right. A stream of thick, dark red blood slung off like a cracked whip. The baby stopped face down, and before I had time to register what was going on, the ravenous lady dove. She laid out like a baseball player making a diving play on a ground ball. She hauled in the bloody, naked baby with both hands, pinned it to the grass, and climbed on top. I froze in shock, unable to move. Sticking out under the lady's left shin were the bottoms of 2 tiny, wrinkled pink feet. Both of her hands pulled, pried, and twisted at the infant. Frustrated with the lack of edible portions, she let out an angry moan. She slammed her face down onto the blood-soaked, sickening mess that just a moment ago was her infant child. Teeth chomped down and ripped away a chunk of bloody skin too big to fit in her mouth. The chunk of flesh flung back and forth as she chewed and sucked it into her mouth like a goddamn rabid animal. I don't know why I wasn't able to move or intervene, but I just couldn't believe what I was watching. I could no longer hear the baby's little catfight sounds, only the moaning and slurping of a predator devouring its prey. I gasped loudly when it registered. I think my stomach flipped over, but I can't be certain. I just felt a rapid bloating sensation, and I emptied my stomach right there on the dew-soaked grass. I hardly knew that I puked. All I could do was stand there stunned and watch this lady eating her baby. I remembered only 10 minutes ago lying on the grass with her baby, and I tried not to wonder what would happen to them. Now I wish I didn't have to know. Tennis shoes slapping on the blacktop grew louder. even though I couldn't bring myself to look. A hand grabbed me, and I felt tugging on my right shoulder. I couldn't process who or what grabbed me. All I could focus on was the lady and her damn baby. The lady's bloody face whipped in my direction, and stringy, bloody drool slung from her chin. My ears began to work again, and all the sounds that I couldn't comprehend began to make sense. The lady hissed at me like a wild alley cat. I heard the nurse behind me call out, "Come on, let's go!" It was then I became aware of the hand on my shoulder. She pulled my arm hard enough to yank me off my center of balance. I stumbled sideways slightly as I regained my composure. Her hand let go of my arm, and we sprinted down the street. Tim was in the truck ready to go with the passenger door open. I slowed down to look back at the blood-covered lady. She still gave chase, however she was slow, clumsy, and made no attempt to avoid obstacles in her path. I watched her walk into the front end of a car as if it wasn't even there. She tripped and fell onto the ground out of my sight. The sounds of jeans dragging across the blacktop broke my gaze of the baby-eating lady. I stopped and stood still, listening, trying to pinpoint the location of the sounds. I could hear material ripping and horrible guttural moans. I quietly walked around the car in front of me. A man lay on the ground using his arms to drag himself across the blacktop. He didn't notice me at first, so I just watched him. He was leaving a dark snail trail of vomit and shit on the asphalt behind him. What the fuck? Apparently I spoke too loud because his head whipped around and he hissed at me. Spit flung from his mouth as he began to rise to his feet. I stepped to my left and bumped into the rear door of a different car. A man's face slammed in the passenger side window. It was the man that bit Tim. He must have put him in the car somehow. His face began to slam into the glass with a sickening crunch. Blood streamed down the glass from his broken nose. I turned away from the blood smudges on the cracked back window and saw the other man find his feet and stagger my way. His eyes were milky white and his dead pale skin was thick with black varicose veins. He stumbled toward me, dragging his feet as he came nearer. I took several steps backwards, too shocked to run. The thing's cryptic eyes remained locked on me while it moved closer. It struggled to maintain balance with every meandering step it took. He staggered and swerved about like it had no sense of depth perception. I stared at the creature curiously while it continued its awkward march closer. Is that as fast as they move? On a hunch, I began to slowly walk toward the wretched beast. He swiped his blood-soaked arms out in a feeble attempt to grab me. His lunge was not fast, nor did it come close. Just as I started to think I pressed my luck enough, a horn blew from behind me. Tim was telling me it was time to go. I ran to the truck and jumped in, and Tim drove away. Okay, what the fuck are those things? That goddamn lady was eating her... I trailed off as the panicked tone of my voice gave way to realization. I paused and looked down at the state of my vomit-soaked clothes and winced at the filth that covered me. I used the back of my right hand to wipe away as much of the still wet vomit from my chin as I could. This all had to be some kind of fucked up dream, right? There's no way all these people could look like they do and still be walking around like a bunch of fucking zombies. I remembered Tim's bite, and I said, "How's your wrist?" Careful not to sound overly concerned. Tim's answer was with a very shaky voice. I don't know. I guess it's okay." He cleared his throat and took a deep breath before he continued. "What the fuck is going on out there? What is wrong with everyone?" I looked back out the car window, watching the wretched thing stagger after us, and I said, "I don't know, bro, but we need to get the fuck out of here as fast as possible." This is the end of Chapter 1 of The Day the Dead Rose by A.R. Pearson. Please subscribe for more content and more stories in the world of The Day the Dead Rose. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.